its languages, its archives, and even its silences. Across the Southern Hemisphere, our stories have been shaped by trade routes and migration, struggle and imagination, and decisions made generations before we even arrived. The Southern Question is a podcast about curiosity. Together with leaders, historians, and citizens, we explore the tensions and forces that shaped our past, our present, and the possibilities that shape our future. This is where history lives. This is where history speaks. And this is where we begin. I'm Jolene Martin, and I'll be asking the Southern Question.
What lies beneath Cape Town? Beneath the Castle of Good Hope, beneath the Grand Parade, beneath the Golden Acre. This week on The Southern Question, maritime archaeologist Dr. Bruno Werz, FSA, takes us deep into the origins of the Cape, through shipwrecks, handwritten journals, and the first encounters between the VOC, the Khoikhoi, and the Sun. At the center of it all lies the Haarlem, a shattered Dutch ship that may have changed the course of South African history forever. This episode explores how identity, language, trade, and power collided in Table Bay, and how those collisions still shape South Africa today.
Dr. Bruno, welcome to the Southern Question. As I've said, we've given people an introduction to who you are, but I want them to know from my personal perspective how I've always just enjoyed being in your company and learning from you. Every visit with you is one of education. But my research didn't unfold what you had told me earlier, sir, in that when you walked into the castle, you have a history here that I did not know about, dating back to when you were about 27 years old. Tell us.
Well, it's quite strange. I was brought over as a maritime archaeologist. That's somebody who researches, amongst other things, shipwrecks. But the very first project I was offered coming down here was in the castle, in the Cape Town castle. And at the time the castle was under renovation, and colleagues of mine from UCT's archaeology department were excavating here. And they excavated all over the place, but one location they couldn't excavate was the old well, the water well underneath the cat. And I was asked if I could do that job, and I said yes. So I spent a few weeks digging up the well underneath the cut. And it started at a water depth of about 1 meter. And when I was finished, the well was over 9 meters deep. And out came all kinds of artifacts, but specifically case bottles, small bottles with spirits originally, which can fit in well in the pockets of a battle dress, so a military uniform. I found insignia, obviously awarded during a ceremony, and after that they had a party, and some of the insignia were lost in the well. I found coins, of course, but also the skeleton of a cat and some rats that found their end in the deep waters of the well.
Is this the very same well that still exists here at the very heart of the castle?
Correct. Originally the source for water, drinking water, and especially in a time of siege. But yes, since the 17th century, it has existed as the castle well.
A, where does that water come from? B, it must have been a very precious commodity at that time, fresh drinking water. Was it one of many or the only?
No, it was this site where the castle was constructed it had a river streaming through it, or river is maybe a big term for that, but a stream from Table Mountain that found its way along the sides, the slopes of the mountain, through the Table Valley into the sea, into Table Bay. And the Dutch constructed their first buildings along the fresh river, the Versrivier. and that was the name of the stream.
So it was very valuable.
It was, and it was also the common anchorage, or the common anchorage was just across in Table Bay, where the ships would meet, the ships on their intercontinental journeys. And they would take in fresh water from this stream, from the fresh river, to be used on board ship.
So I love narrative, I'm an actress, I think of stories. Is that why the castle was built then? Was to protect this freshwater source?
The castle was a replacement for the old fort Bar van Riebeek, and that was situated under the present-day Golden Acre and the present-day bus station. You can still see some of the contours, the silhouette of the fort, but over the years that has been destroyed, unfortunately. And in the 17th century, the second half of the 17th century, after Van Riebeek came, it soon became clear that the original fort didn't function very well. It was constructed of local earth and stone, not so much stone for the ramparts. They used earth for that. And every Cape winter, with, especially after a fierce storm, they had to reconstruct part of the original Van Riebeek's fort. So then soon after, they decided it's better to build a permanent structure, a stone fort, and that was constructed a little bit further to the northeast, and that is the current castle. And that was constructed in the 1660s, early 1670s.
When I was in high school, I used to take a taxi from high school and a bus, and I used to walk to those bottom layers of the Golden Acre. And there are ruins there. Are you saying that those are the ruins of the old Jan van Riebeek fort?
No, the old fort was underneath the current bus station and the Grand Parade, part of the Grand Parade. And what you see in the Golden Acre, those are the remains of Wagenaar's Dam. And that was a freshwater reservoir to catch the freshwater coming down from the slopes of Table Mountain. And that was during the period of Governor Wagenaar, the follow-up of Van Riebeek, who constructed that reservoir. That was the place where the ships would fill their casks with fresh drinking water.
Hasn't the parade just been sold?
I don't know about that.
I do.
I thought it was...
Maybe someone can help us on social media and find out. I think I just saw that, because when they were trying to sell or sold the Good Hope Center, I had read somewhere that the Grand Parade had been sold. But
maybe the Golden Acre.
Maybe the Golden Acre.
But I don't think the Grand Parade can be sold, because
Right.
it's part of the city of Cape Town.
There's so much history in this precinct.
Absolutely.
And I'm kind of getting the feeling also that the castle is not separate from the Indigenous history. Is the castle built on top of it?
Is the current castle built on top of what?
The history of the Indigenous people.
That is a difficult question. I'm not aware of any specific remains of Indigenous people or any archaeological material associated with it that was found in the castle. But in general, you can say, well, this is of course part of the landscape where Indigenous people roamed, where they lived, where they basically camped. But I'm not aware of any specific archaeological finds.
I think it is safe to say if there was a freshwater stream here, it could have maybe been used for grazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they must have grazed here as well. I know that when Van Riebeek came here, established the first fort, official fort, these people, they traded with the Indigenous people. they came to the fort. There are plenty of records. Some of them even stayed in the fort during the day to assist the people from Europe with establishing themselves. They traded cattle. During the day they would trade cattle. The cattle would be taken by the Dutch, protected in a kraal at the back of the fort. And at night sometimes the indigenous people would walk past, whistle, and their cows would break out and they would join the original flock again. So yes, this area has a very rich history, and fortunately a lot is recorded in the diaries that the people from Europe kept at the time, because of course the indigenous people didn't have the knowledge of writing or recording in different ways besides oral tradition.
One of the reasons why I absolutely love your work is because sometimes when a young person is trying to dig into history and find things, we often land up with oral history that it's not anchored to anything. But your work is always anchored in something written, a text. Or when I came to you once, I said, tell me about the strandlopers. Is there anything that proves the strandlopers? And you whipped out text, and it excited me. Now in South Africa, we are in a very interesting period where history text is being looked at and possibly rewritten, revised, added to, being made more Afrocentric. I want to know from you the text around the Haarlem. For those of us who don't know what the Haarlem is, tell us what the Haarlem is, and then give us some insight into text around it.
Haarlem is the name of a town in the Netherlands, and it became the namesake for a ship, a Dutch East India Company ship, a merchant ship that plied the trade routes to and from the east. The Dutch East India Company enriched itself on the trade with Asia. At the time, Asiatic products were very much in demand, and the profit margin that could be obtained in trading these items was enormous. And the company became, for that reason, one of the first, well, it is regarded as the first multinational corporation in the world. It had a capital which surpasses, if you can convert it with companies nowadays. So the VOC had a capital which was just enormous. If you convert it to modern day standards, it would surpass the capital of companies like Microsoft and IBM. So it was an enormous organization. For that reason, it also obtained privileges from the Dutch national government at the time. So it was a commercial company, an individual company, and not a state company, but an individual company that colonized parts of Asia, exchanged goods against money, imported those goods and sold them with a huge profit. And that was the motivation behind, and that is why the company had its own trading vessels. They built their own ships. They had a standing army, a private army, to protect their interests on board ships, but also in the various outposts. It used its own coinage. Its own coins were struck in the Netherlands in existing facilities, but under their own mark. So it was a company that held tremendous power, and as part of that power there were numerous ships that it constructed and that it operated. And Haarlem was just one of those hundreds of ships. And Haarlem undertook a few of these intercontinental voyages, carrying trade products back to Europe to be sold. So it was a merchantman. Some people in the past have said that it was a slaver, that it carried slaves. That's not true. It was purely a merchantman, but a ship that could also be used for offensive and defensive purposes. It was sometimes, in times of war, the Dutch government requested support from the Dutch East India Company and its ships and soldiers to fight battles with them against the French, against the Brits. So that shows another aspect of the company. To a certain part, it was also a military organization. But Haarlem, its function was purely trading, and it made a few very successful voyages to the east and back. And on the return of its fourth voyage, it stranded in Table Bay. And what happened then, it stranded with it stranded in 1647 with 120 people. Half of the people were taken over by other ships that sailed in convoy. They were brought back to Europe, but another 62 stayed behind to try and salvage as much as was possible from the very rich cargo. And they survived here on the shores of Table Bay for a period of just over a year. And in order to survive, they built a camp. And that camp, called Fort Sandcastle, Sondenburg, was home to them for, as I said, just over a year. And from the fort, which served as a base, they most of the time worked on the wreck to salvage material, but they also used it as a foothold to explore the interior. They went fishing in the Salt River to supply themselves. They sailed to Robben Island to club seals, to catch penguins, to collect eggs of seabirds. And yes, at some stage, after a few months of living on the shores of Table Bay, they encountered indigenous people. And that opened a whole new episode in the history of South Africa.
There is extensive information around the Haarlem,
There is.
around the VOC. Is that because it was, as you say, a company?
Yes. The company was very...
Your company records?
Yes, it was very well structured. It was very well organized. It had many different laws and bylaws and instructions on how all aspects of the company had to be managed, from the bookkeeping to the loading of goods on board ships, to the payout of salaries to widows and orphans of those sailors that passed on during those long intercontinental voyages, or the soldiers that died during conflicts in the East. It was all meticulously instructed and recorded on how to facilitate these various aspects of the company, of the organization. And everybody involved, especially the administrative personnel, were instructed to keep proper books, of course for the accountants, but also to describe various aspects like the quality of certain spices or textiles. They had such a good insight that they could predict, like in 2 years' time, because of course every leg to the east and back took an average of about 9 months. So people in charge, they needed the expertise to predict like what goods will be in demand in about 2 years from now. So they had to base their order for the east on what they assumed would be in fashion at the time. So they produced what is called the Oes for India, the demand for India, and they specify specifically what types of porcelains needed to be purchased, in what quantities or amounts, what different silks from different parts in Asia needed to be purchased, in what colors. So it was a company that had various arms, various branches, with experts in various fields. So it was a complex organization with thousands of employees, both in Europe, in the Netherlands, and overseas in various outposts. So some of those are quite well known. Like the company had posts in Japan, Decima. It had posts in China. It had posts, of course, in present-day Indonesia, that were the Dutch East Indies. So Jakarta, Batavia, but also in Sri Lanka, Galle, in Persia. So they were all over the Middle and the Far East, and had specific bases to operate from. But because the Netherlands was only a small nation with only a small population, it couldn't colonize. And that's why they established outposts, which you could see, which you can regard as like an embassy at this day and age. But it certainly wasn't the size of the colonies that the British and the French established, because those nations had many more inhabitants that could be located in these overseas posts.
If I think of myself doing online shopping now, I want my silk and my satin now. I don't want to wait for months.
Well, you're already halfway, because that, of course, was the reason why the Cape was established. The Cape is situated at about halfway. So once you leave the Netherlands on board a ship, it takes about 3 months to reach the Cape. By the time, in the 17th century, the 18th century, of course there was no way of preserving except for pickling stuff. So there were no coolers, and the result was that a lot of the provisions, they perished, they became rotten, they were no longer usable for consumption. And for about half a century, the company had been operating by sending ships directly from the Netherlands to the Far East. And that average duration of that voyage was about 9 months. So they were desperately looking for a position halfway where they could replenish the ships with fresh drinking water, with fresh produce. And with the founding of Haarlem, with the experience that the people gained, they stayed here for more than a year, insight in the landscape, the vegetation, the products of the land, but also the friendly contacts they established with the indigenous people. The Cape became a target, and everybody at the time, after reading the reports, was of the opinion, yes, that's the most suitable place to establish this halfway station. And that is why 5 years after the Haarlem founded, a formal expedition was equipped to establish a permanent stronghold at the Cape.
The Cape is still extremely strategic, as we're seeing now with the war and the closing to some of the Straits of Hormuz, etc. So what you're saying is so relevant in 2026. We've spoken extensively now about the VOC and the Haarlem. Let's talk about pre-Haarlem. So this is essentially what our curriculum should be doing as well. preempting it a little bit. Describe to us who the sailors found here, what life was like here, what did they speak, what did it sound like?
I'm not a linguist, and I wouldn't dare to try and pronounce it properly. But this is the point. The people who originally spoke the language, like the Kuku, they have disappeared. They died. They lived in the 17th century, and when the people from Haarlem and others observed them, who recorded some of their specific characteristics, sometimes in great detail, but there are certain things we can't revive or check if they are accurate. And the only thing we can go by is the written record, assuming that the people at the time, during the 17th century, tried to record the original Kulu language as correctly as possible. But from there we can only surmise that this was the way it was pronounced, or give a few alternatives. And the same applies to Latin, classical Latin. Nobody knows exactly the way in which Romans pronounced Latin. We have gained knowledge of Latin through handing over in documentation from the Middle Ages, especially through the Roman Catholic Church. But the Church Latin that is spoken nowadays may well differ a lot from the original Roman Latin. And I think the same, at least we should bear in mind that the same option exists with regards to the Kulu language.
Yes.
That we nowadays may not pronounce it the way in which it was pronounced so many generations ago. Because it's simple, there are no tape recordings of it.
There was the Khoikhoi, the Cape Khoi, and also the Sun.
Correct. When the guys of the people from the Haarlem arrived here, they didn't meet with the Sun. The Sun obviously were in elsewhere, and during the time of Van Riebeeck, so 5 years later, expeditions are sent out into the interior. And then there is a record that about 5 years after Van Riebeeck came here, they met Sun in the far north, what is nowadays the northern province, or on the border with Namibia, or just in what is currently South Namibia. And there they met, and they described that lively as a race, very short of stature, smaller than the Kru, but looking very similar to them and speaking a similar type of language. But their language was even more difficult to understand. So they described them as a poor people that are hunter-gatherers. They live off hunting down animals. They're very poor. Their other means of subsistence were honey, and if they could get it, although they mostly lived in the interior, some fish. But mostly honey, fruits of the field, and of course game. And they're described as very friendly. They welcomed the foreigners. They tried to communicate. That didn't materialize. But then they are again left to their own devices. So the Dutch, the first few years that Van Riebeeck and his people came down here, they sometimes sent out expeditions to the interior. And the reasons were to familiarize themselves with the environment, but also to look for potential sources of revenue, because they operated under the VOC. And the VOC was a trading organization that tried to invest in the most positive way. So they wanted to see a return on their investment. And rumors, of course, existed at the time of very rich countries in Africa, like Ophir, a fabled gold land. So Van Riebeeck and his men went out, and later Simon van der Stel and other governors, and they explored the interior. And during one of those expeditions...
I'm so sorry to interrupt, I'm smiling because you said Simon van der Stel, and we are in the Simon van der Stel room.
Absolutely.
When does that happen? As you were, sir.
So these expeditions went out. They tried to find the fabled gold, which they were not very successful at. But for example, Simon van der Stel later discovered very rich copper mines in Namibia. And so that was worthy of exploration. And the same happened in the first few years. Expeditions went out, and one of those expeditions stumbled on a tribe of San, of Bushmen. And they observed them, they met on friendly terms, they were polite to each other, and the Dutch were welcomed by the Bushmen, treated to a meal, including honey, which was one of the things they collected. And basically they were hunter-gatherers, and they're described by the Dutch as very friendly, a very poor race of small people, smaller than the Koo or the Khoi, speaking a similar language, but even more complicated. And they couldn't make any sense out of it. So communication must have been taking place with a lot of facial expressions and movements. But these first contacts were very friendly. But then, of course, they got broken off when the Dutch or the Europeans went back to the Cape Station. And it turned out later that there was animosity most of the time between the Koo and the San. And the Koo, with whom the Dutch were in daily contact, a bigger nation, a nation that provided them with cattle, they despised the San, and they regarded them as robbers, and they sometimes looked for protection against them because the San tried to kill them or tried to rob them, amongst others, of their wives. So there was not a really good contact. So when the Dutch came to the Cape, they only met with the Koo.
I love that you've said Koo, because it is Koo, Kwe, Khoi semantics. We understand who and what we're talking about. Earlier you mentioned that the Khoi had, or Kuku, had died off. Clearly not all of them, but what did they die from?
You're referring to the later 17th century?
Earlier you had said that they had died, the Khoi.
The Khoi over in time, they lost their identity because of integration with other people that established themselves at the Cape. When you talk about dying off, one important aspect there is the smallpox.
That's what I was trying to get to. There were diseases that were introduced.
Correct.
Which impacted greatly.
Absolutely. And that is a phenomenon that you unfortunately see in history over time. The same occurred in South America. The same occurred in different other regions, that people get confronted with diseases that they were not exposed to before. And at the Cape, that was smallpox. Smallpox most probably brought by a ship, unwittingly, a ship that carried a few children that had smallpox, but they survived. They got cured at sea on the way to the Cape, and when they arrived at the Cape, the clothes were washed. And then some indigenous people during that process came into contact, possibly because they had to wash the clothes. So they fell ill, and then it spread amongst the indigenous population and the European population. And a traveler to the Cape observed this, and he wrote a very reliable report that both the Europeans were affected, within some households up to 5 children dying, that there was nobody to be found anymore to care for the sick because there were too many sick, and all the people were of course too afraid to be exposed to it. And at the end of the day, people couldn't be buried properly anymore because there was not enough wood for coffins. He describes that in Cape Town itself, in its surroundings, the number of Khoi people that were still there, there were just masses of deaf people on the road, and the remainder had fled. They had packed their oxen, they had taken their families, and they went inland to escape the scourge. And they blamed the Dutch for putting a spell on them. So thousands of Khoi people died, but also hundreds of newcomers of people of Western European background. And that was just because nowadays smallpox has been eradicated. But a disease that at the time could be survived by Europeans, but was a death sentence to indigenous people.
I know already what our social media audience is going to say. I can see the comments on Facebook already, because there are some people that believe that smallpox was a kind of warfare, biological warfare of sorts, and that it was the whole blanket theory, etc. But understanding that it could also have been unwitting or unwittingly brought is valid. I want to move away now from that one aspect of our history and move to 3 of my favorite characters in history. They are so fascinating to me. You think you say Auchumayo, I've always said Auchumato. We're semantics. Auchumato, Doman, Krotoa. And when you walk into the castle, that first courtyard, there are bronze statues, and the one on the left is Doman, I believe. Talk to us about these 3 phenomenal characters that I can't wait to see in history books.
Auchumato, Harry, as the Dutch called him.
Yes, or Harry the strandloper.
Or Harry. So a man with different names. An interesting character, a bright character. He was present in 1647. He was most probably a chief of the strandlopers, one of the indigenous groups, hunter-gatherer of foragers, people that lived off the seashore. And no wonder then that at some stage, soon after the founding of Haarlem, while part of the crew was busy on the wreck, they encountered a group of people that walked down the beach and greeted them. And most probably the name was developed that instant. The Dutch saw a few beach walkers, and that is where the name caught on. And to their surprise, one of these people spoke a few words of English. And later it came out that previously he had encountered Englishmen that dropped anchor in Table Bay to get fresh drinking water and produce. And they chatted, and it seems that Harry Ochumau, was taken aboard and brought to current-day Indonesia, where the Brits also had an outpost. He spent some time there, and on the way back, the English dropped him again in Table Bay. And he had learned some English phrases during that time. He had observed some of the others, the people in the East, and he took his advantage with that. So the next English ships he welcomed, and he tried to act not only as an interpreter, but also as an in-between in organizing some deals. And he continued that with the Dutch, and he became of importance to the Dutch, because when 5 years later Van Riebeeck came, the same evening of the same day that Van Riebeeck arrived, Harry already visited him on board his ship, offering his services, and he was not formally employed, but since that time he regularly assisted the Dutch. But he also showed another side. He was a very shrewd businessman.
Yes, thank you.
He sometimes, when it was to his advantage or the advantage of his people, he played out the Dutch against other indigenous people. And this sometimes resulted in conflict. So it could be that one week he was a welcome guest and he ate from the governor's table, or from the commander's table, sorry, Van Riebeeck was a commander. So he ate from Van Riebeeck's table. He informed them of local news. He advised them of what allies to engage with and who was his enemy. But then the week thereafter, he could cut a deal behind Van Riebeeck's back. And then he was sent to Robben Island to regret his deeds.
A shrewd businessman indeed. So you're saying shrewd businessman, global, global, a translator, a negotiator, also an agent of intelligence.
Yes.
Would that be true for all three of those characters, or just Ochumau?
All three of them were important for communicating with the indigenous people. Of course, for the priority was to obtain agreements on supplying the European people with sufficient cattle, but they would also exchange other kinds of information. A very simple example, and I will come back to that later, but we have been searching for the wreck of Haarlem, and during test excavations we found an object which I've identified as a necklace made from European copper that was brought here by ship, but was fashioned by indigenous people. So it is the crown jewel of South Africa. But now what is very interesting is that objects like this are also mentioned in the record, the historical record. And Van Riebeeck records specifically that talking to Harry, Ochumau, he asks Ochumau, what do they do with this copper? Because it was the most wanted object in the trade with the indigenous people. And Harry said, well, we love this, and we fashion all kinds of jewelry from it, like necklaces, like bracelets. And then we trade it with other tribes further in the interior, further to the north, because around Saldanha and St. Helena Bay, there was another tribe of Kru with who the Dutch traded cattle specifically. So the local people would trade copper with the Dutch, fashion it into jewelry, which they traded with the others to get cattle to be brought back to the Cape. So that gives an indication of a local network, so to say, in which Harry and his colleagues like Krutoa, Eva, Doman and others, they had this knowledge because, of course, they had contacts with the local people. And they explained to the Dutch how the trading worked, how it operated.
Do you know how Doman died? Has that come up in your research at all?
No. I think I have to look that up.
Because I've been trying to research. He's my favorite warrior, and there's just conflicting bits of information as to how he died. So I was wondering if you knew. But tell us a bit about Doman.
I can't tell you much about them. The text I sent you.
Did he go to Batavia?
Doman is also one of those interesting characters, and not much is known about him, only that the regular friction between himself and his people and the Dutch. And Doman he caused quite some friction. He was most of the time against the Dutch. And one of the reasons was that at some stage the Dutch gave him an opportunity to go to Batavia, where he spent some of his time, then was brought back. And the Dutch with that hoped to educate him a little bit and to make him realize what his role was. But he took advantage of that by learning certain Dutch military tactics and more knowledge about armaments. So when he came back here, he became an opponent. He was an interpreter used by the Dutch, and at some stage they decided to send him to current-day Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, to learn a bit more, and in the hope that he would pick up some things that would facilitate his position. And when Doman arrived back, he used that against the Dutch. He had picked up some military tactics. He had observed their equipment, their armaments specifically. And for example, he knew that when it rains, the gunpowder that was used in the muskets became useless, became wet, so the Dutch couldn't fire their muskets. And knowing that, he instigated aggressive actions. The Dutch didn't retaliate initially, they withdrew, they protected their cattle, their people, but they tried to avoid conflict as much as possible, which was also an instruction, a direct instruction from the company, to try and avoid armed conflict as much as possible, to maintain a good relationship with the indigenous people. And that was stipulated from the onset. So from the very first step that the newcomers put on the beach, they were fully aware of that. So they maintained that, and Doman tried to take advantage, tried to push his tribesmen to overrun the Dutch, but that didn't happen. And that finally resulted in a peace. And it's called the First Khoikhoi War. And that war only resulted, fortunately, in a few casualties.
Okay.
So then a peace ensued, and then the old relations resumed.
Okay, so it's called the First Khoikhoi War, and I'm listening to you, and as I sit here and I'm reminiscing over my high school history curriculum, I know more about Shaka Zulu and Dingaan than I do about these indigenous warriors in the First Khoikhoi War. Is that something that we're going to fix, do you think, in the new revised curriculum?
I have no clue because I don't take part in any curriculum development. I haven't been asked to do so, and that's up to the authorities in the Department of Education. If asked, I can give my opinion. I don't think it's relevant. Anybody who's interested can always read further, can always obtain more information via internet. And unfortunately, undoubtedly, they will come across information on, for example, the Haarlem and the research project that I'm undertaking. So somebody who wants a more broader perspective, maybe even a more balanced perspective, can look things up via internet.
I love that.
But now you touched on something which I would like to emphasize, because in the past a lot of things surrounding Haarlem and the very first interaction with Europeans has been misunderstood. We have discussed the Khoi specifically in great detail. I would like to make it absolutely clear that when the incident with the Haarlem occurred, when Van Riebeeck appeared here, the first half a century at least, there is no mention, there is no presence of black South Africans as we know them today, meaning specifically Xhosa and Zulu. And a lot of people will not realize that these tribes didn't exist at the Cape at the time. At the time it was only the Khoi. And the Khoi slowly disappeared from history, their identity dissolved for various reasons, because they were integrated in a new society that started to emerge at the time, but also because of smallpox. The remainder being integrated, taken in by European farmers as farmhands. So the Khoi in time lost their identity. But they were the original people that were here when these first Europeans came down here to settle permanently. And in the past, I've encountered some people who thought that it was the Xhosa that were here, and that was not the case.
Fascinating. What responsibility do we have in presenting a more balanced history? So for instance, the exercise of revising our curriculum. But I suppose it goes without saying, the responsibility is great. Some people think it's a useless exercise though.
I think that's everybody's personal objective. What I would like to see is a curriculum that is balanced, and there I must say yes. To focus on aspects of the French Revolution is indeed of lesser relevance than to promote more South African history. And when it comes to South African history, I think there should be a fair amount of attention to be paid to various episodes. From what I wasn't at school in South Africa, but from what I understand is that there was an emphasis on the Groot Trek. Well, I think it's very important as a professional historian that history is treated as objectively as possible, with acknowledgement of wrongdoings by people in the past, with not sugarcoating certain events, but to follow the original documentation in the form of archival material, but also sometimes oral tradition by interviews with different people, but to find information that can be checked for its originality and for its objectiveness. And that I find is most important, to provide an account of past events which is as neutral as possible. In the case of this new curriculum development, which is aimed at every South African, young South African, my suggestion would be to devote attention to the various highlights that this national history has, to devote more or less equal time to each subject matter, and to treat it in the same way, as neutral as possible, as based on as much evidence as possible. And then I see a progression in time. I would suggest to incorporate a prehistoric part. Southern Africa is the cradle of humankind. So I think that even in a history curriculum, some attention needs to be devoted to archaeology, because the origins, the original development of humankind lies strongly in these parts. So some attention should be devoted to that. Progressing in time to where you come to the indigenous people of which records exist, records produced by others, and then we touch on people like the Sun, the Ku. Then, of course, the contacts that followed with people from overseas, Europeans, what developments those caused, which is properly documented, and then using the historical record further to discuss certain aspects that are highlights in individual population groups' history. So, for example, there you can think of Afrikaners and the Great Trek, but you can also think of highlights of other population groups that you can pick up as some examples. Because in a curriculum, it's not possible to discuss all aspects of everybody's history. You have to make choices, but then make balanced choices. What is important for these people at present, and is there sufficient material to develop a curriculum that is as unbiased and as balanced as possible. And that is of value to everybody.
Thank you for that. I guess my last question then would be, what would it mean to center these voices and these encounters in the curriculum? And you're never going to be a young brown kid in Cape Town, but I was. And the curriculum as it stands did lend itself to making me feel inferior. But I feel like with a more balanced view, it could be beneficial to our young people. Do you agree?
Yes, and another aspect I would like to add is make history exciting, make it fun. There are so many things you can use to tell stories about. I've been going out to schools in Mitchell's Plain to talk about the encounters of the people from the Haarlem with the Ku. I've been talking to them about prehistory, about the development of humans. Depending on the age group, I used media like face paint. And it was great fun. And for me it was a relaxation and also the fulfillment of a commitment I felt I had by making history a pleasure, a fun thing for everybody involved, from the age of 5, 6 to the age of 18. Now, I'm not saying that an 18 years should put face paint on, but you can make history appealing to those population groups as well. So I would challenge teachers that will have to follow this curriculum to think a little bit outside the box as well, and to maybe introduce one or two small items that can make it just that more exciting. And that can include also a visit to a historical site. So, yeah, there are so many additional things you can take and absorb in this process. And I would urge the people that are developing this curriculum not only to think about how are we going to write it down, how are we going to classify it, but also how can we make it more attractive? How can we make it fun? Because history is fun. In some cases. In some cases it's sad, and that story should also be told. So also include that in the curriculum. There are so many ways of making this more viable, more alive. I mean, look
More real.
Sorry?
More real.
More real, definitely. And I remember myself as a schoolboy in the Netherlands. I hated history. It was so dry, it was so boring. And then later I realized it's such a waste, because you can make it so much fun and so much more attractive.
You really can.
I mean, here we sit in the castle. This is living history around us. Just to walk here, just to taste that atmosphere. So I would urge every school to come to the castle, just to taste that atmosphere. Not because it's a Dutch colonial monument, because it's history, it's breathing history.
Even what you've done for me on a personal level, you being a maritime archaeologist, what you've done for me is you've started a passion about maritime archaeology, and so I've started freediving, because that's what I want to explore. I want to explore the other realm. So making history alive again. There are various ways one can do that. Dr. Bruno, at the end of every episode, we finish with the Southern question, which is not meant to be answered. We really leave it with the audience so that they remain curious and go on their own explorations and their own adventures. And I feel the question you've left me with today is that if we are looking at wondrous characters like Auchamato, Harry the Strandloper, Doman, Kratoa, it makes me wonder, who are the other voices, who are the other encounters that we have yet to discover, and how do we honor them in the rewriting of our history? A long question, but I think it's an important one. I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you for hosting us in your old haunt, where you uncovered a well, and you were a tour guide, like these noisy tour guides we had here all day interrupting your interview. Dr. Bruno, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for your graciousness. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.